I Am Malala is a biographical story about a young girl who grew up in Swat Valley, Pakistan. It was written with the help of Christina Lamb for the adult version and Patrick McCormick for the young adult version. Malala Yousafzai is a religious Muslim girl who grew up going to school just like any other child. She took great care in her studies as her parents had high expectations for her. However, at a point during her childhood, the Taliban took hold of the region she was living in and started issuing edicts about the lives of the citizens there. Most of these edicts were targeted at controlling the actions and modesty of members of society, specifically women, in a perverted understanding and dictation of the Quran. It started with the veiling of the girls and soon got more aggressive with trying to keep women out of the public eye. This eventually resulted in them forcing girls to stop attending school, sometimes through violence. Malala's father, however, was very much in favor of education, owned a school, and encouraged Malala not only to continue attending but to speak out about her life in Pakistan for the BBC. They thought no one would ever come after Malala, a child. But unfortunately, they were wrong. In 2012, when Malala was 15, a Taliban member boarded the bus she was riding to school and shot her in the head. Miraculously, she survived, and the book details her life from before and after the events of that day as a hero, role model, and symbol of resilience. Both books followed the same basic story, as it is a non-fiction novel, but with a few key differences which we will speak about later. Some of the themes of the book include education, activism, family, religion, and faith, women's rights, and maturing quickly in the face of adversity. On activism, from the first time that Malala wrote a blog entry about the Taliban, she was an activist against their disruptive view of the Quran. It would have been far easier for Malala to stop speaking out, to hide in her home as the Taliban had ordered, but she had a duty to raise her voice. This eventually resulted in her being shot, but she still continues to speak out now in the year 2018, inspiring other activists to do so as well. On family. Family is also a huge part of this book, as the narrative focuses not only on the tragedy of her life, but on the wonderful time she spent with them and how their upbringing influenced her greatly. It also focuses a lot on the bonds of her family, their own history, and the harrowing choices they had to make to stay together. On religion and faith. Though the Taliban, a religious fanatical group who praised the same Lord as she, came after Malala, she never lost her faith and continues to insist that what they're doing is a misinterpretation of it. Malala often preaches that her religion is one of peace and tolerance despite the violence of these outliers. On women's rights, one quote from the book, "There are two powers in the world. One is the sword and the other is the pen. There is a third power stronger than both, that of women." This was originally spoken by Muhammad al-Janai, but it is often referenced by Malala and is the motto of her fund. There's a portion of the beginning of the book where her birth was looked down upon by her relatives for not being a son. It was her father's response that helped her to grow up and become the strong woman she is today, treating her just as he would a son and scorning his relatives for thinking less of her for her gender. This also comes to the front with the Taliban as they begin issuing rules only to women, such as having to wear clothing that covers all their exposed skin and closing schools only for that sex, and how Malala chooses to oppose them by both not wearing the full body scarf and by attending school anyway. On education is vitally important to this book and Malala's life. It is mentioned or is the main part of nearly every chapter. It was precisely because Malala cared so much about her education that she was a victim of violence in the first place. Malala strongly pushes for education, especially education for all children regardless of gender, and is often heard stating how the only solution to war is a good teacher. To quote Malala, "One child, one teacher, one book, one pen can change the world. Education is the only solution."
Hello all, this is Brandon Lee, and I'll be speaking to some of the differences between the young adult version of I Am Malala, co-written with Patricia McCormick, and the original version, the adult version, co-authored with Christina Lamb. Firstly, could a young English-speaking person aged 9 to 14 read the adult version? Perhaps, but there's a lot going on, which begs the question, what is the purpose of young adult adaptations of books published for adult audiences? I'll leave that question open-ended. So what did the writer and editor see fit to admit in producing a young adult adaptation of this book? I will highlight three things. 1, the portrayal of Islam. 2, the historical and socio-political reality of Pakistan and the United States' intervention in Pakistan following 9/11. And 3, the role of Malala's father. In the adult version, Malala and the co-author write, "We Muslims are split between Sunnis and Shias. We share the same fundamental beliefs and the same Holy Quran, but we disagree over who was the right person to lead our religion when the Prophet died in the 7th century. She goes on to better explain the division of leadership, but in the young adult text, this entire section is glossed over. In the adult version, Malala and the co-author explain how Pakistani officials were working both sides of the war in Afghanistan, saying that every so often an important American official would complain that we, the Pakistani people, weren't doing enough, and then suddenly some big fish would be caught. She goes on, my father and his friends said that the Americans always preferred dealing with dictators in Pakistan. Later on, Malala writes about the first U.S. drone strike on Pakistani soil and the resulting outrage it produced in her country. We were not at war with the Americans and were shocked that they would launch attacks from the sky on our soil. Both these excerpts explain what it was like for a innocent person on the receiving end of U.S. aggression, especially in a country that the U.S. was not officially at war with. Finally, is the role of Malala's father. I read the adult version first and was dismayed to see that the young adult version really toned his advocacy down. In the adult version, he's seen as a progressive Pakistani organizer, determined to bring education to all in the valley that he lives in, to clean up the environment that is being destroyed by increasing industrialism and the waste accompanying that. And he also advocates a position of justice when all that is being offered to Pakistan and the Pakistani people is ruled by the Taliban or ruled by a corrupt government with U.S. support. So what? The young adult version leaves a lot out and had me wanting much more after I read the adult version. This all just made me wonder, what's the point of reading this book if it doesn't reveal something new, profound, and challenging for English-speaking audiences? What good does admitting so much for the young adult audience do, ultimately? Thank you for listening.
So Brandon points out 3 omissions in the youth adaptation text. As a recap, these are the portrayal of Islam as a complex religion, the historical and socio-political reality of Pakistan and U.S. intervention, and the political activism of Malala's father. So leaving these aspects out of the youth adaptation text is problematic for a number of reasons, the most obvious being that readers are not left with a clear depiction of Malala's reality, and by extension, Malala herself. Malala is a devout Muslim, and she is heavily invested in the political realm, as is her father, who inspires her daily. And we cannot understand Malala if, as readers, we are not willing or able to open ourselves up to all of these factors that inform her decisions, behaviors, and identity. Now, a counter-argument would be that these aspects of the text were omitted because young readers may not be able to understand the complexities of religion and politics, but I do not buy into this for a couple of reasons. For one, in the original version, Malala writes about these subjects in a very accessible way. She writes for someone who does not know about the history of Pakistan and the history of Islam, and she does not use difficult vocabulary. So the tools that young readers would need to understand these subjects are there in the original version of the text. I think that if we try to understand why these aspects were omitted, we need to consider the preconceived notions and stereotypes that are floating around about youth. I think that by omitting these important aspects of Malala's life in the youth adaptation version really perpetuates the stereotype that adolescence is a self-absorbed and impulsive time. For example, I find it interesting that while most of the political, historical, familial, and religious elements are either cut or simplified, Malala's rebelliousness and her disputes with her siblings and friends are actually played up in the youth adaptation version. While Malala includes some notes about her best friend and sibling disputes in the original version, I would not categorize this as one of the bigger themes. She's more concerned about the well-being of others. However, in the youth adaptation version, the structure of the text is reorganized so that everything seems to circle back to Malala's quarrels with her best friend and siblings and her place as a top scholar of her class. So as an example, I'm going to read an excerpt on page 12 from the youth adaptation version that focuses on Malala's quarrels with her brother. She states, "I don't fight with him. He fights with me. We argue over the TV remote, over chores, over who is the better student, over whatever you can think of. When I was younger and these brothers started coming along, I had a little talk with God. I said, 'You did not check with me before sending these two.'" This is only one example of something that consistently happens throughout the youth adaptation text. Another example of the text playing up Malala's rebelliousness and playing into adolescent stereotypes is when she steals her neighbor's toy jewelry as an act of retaliation. Through this stealing incidents, it's problematic because though the stealing incidents is included in the original text, it is problematic that these are the things that make it to the youth adaptation version, and it plays into stereotypes about adolescents as being impulsive. Although the goal here was to make Malala more relatable, I think that the decision to play up her quarrels with her friends and family while excluding and simplifying her history, religion, political views, and her family struggles play into stereotypes and actually make the text seem less authentic. I also noticed that all of the details about Malala's favorite DVDs and TV shows were played up. Why include these details but leave out Malala's discussions about history and politics in the youth adaptation? Does this perpetuate stereotypes about youth interests? Furthermore, I noticed that some things that happened to certain characters in the original version of the text were reframed as things that happened to Malala herself in the youth adaptation. For example, in the original text, Malala writes about how her father tried to lighten his skin with buffalo milk when he was younger. On page 21, she states, "He used to go to the fields to get buffalo milk to spread on his face, thinking that it would make him lighter." In the youth adaptation text, this is something that Malala does to herself. On page 12 of the adaptation, she states, "When I was younger, I tried to lighten my skin with honey, rosewater, and buffalo milk." Reframing certain events as things that happened to Malala herself does not really seem to have a practical function. I wonder, why do this? I think that reframing events in this way also plays into stereotypes that adolescents are self-absorbed. Does the fact that her father was acutely aware of colorism somehow make it less powerful than if this was something that Malala experienced herself? What does this say about presumptions about youth and empathy? The last problematic difference that I'd like to touch on is the fact that the youth adaptation text downplays Malala's understanding of and involvement in girls' rights. In both of the texts, Malala is depicted as someone who's deeply invested in the welfare of girls, but this seems to be unintentionally downplayed due to the simplification of issues that women and girls are faced with in the youth adaptation version. In the original version of the text, Malala points out issues of sexual violence, child marriage, and pedophilia. She talks about these things openly. For example, she talks about young girls who are married off to old men, and she also describes a situation in which her mother had to defend herself from a man while they were IDPs. In the youth adaptation version, these specific details about the struggles that women and girls are faced with are completely omitted. So, who are we protecting by omitting these details?
Hello, this is Michael Kasuth, and I'm going to be talking about a few similarities between the two books. The biggest similarity that struck me while I was reading the Young People's edition was how similar the tone was across each book. While the author had changed the diction, the choice of words to be a lot more accessible, the tone remained the same. This conversational tone makes one think of a close friend telling a story that they find important, and so you also find it important. The tone in the book also carries Malala's passion for educational activism. It is clear by the way she tells her story that she believes that she is on the right side of history and wants to change the world. Her fiery ambition for a better world made me cry as I finished each book. Keeping the tone similar across the books helps to create similar feelings for each. The idea here is to reach younger audiences, to get them to feel the same things that the adults can feel, and I think that this book accomplished that. A question that is raised from this is, do any young people have the ability or the right to tell their own stories? Malala is clearly an extraordinary young person, but even she had to rely on adults to help her tell her story. Is there any way to allow young people to freely communicate? And is that something that they want?
Hi, this is Amanda Blay, and I'm going to talk about some similarities between the two Malala books. So I'm going to share some things about these books that might be a little more obvious, but since not everyone read these books or has access to them, I will share them anyways. Even though there are many differences that these books have between them, I believe they still share enough similarities. There is a lot of content and information that is presented in both books. Starting off, they are broken down very similarly. Each one comes with a very organized table of contents. The two books both share the same map of Pakistan, which shows her hometown of Swat in greater detail. This small component allows any reader, regardless of what audience they belong to, a chance to see what Malala is referring to in her stories. The beginning of the books each have a prologue that essentially shares the same story. The Young Reader's edition begins with her reminiscing about her life back in Swat from her more current residence in Birmingham, England. She refers to that infamous day she was shot and ends her prologue with, "Who is Malala? I am Malala, and this is my story." In the adult version, the prologue directly starts talking about the day she was shot. She then uses that similar frame seen in the Young Reader's edition by reminiscing about SWAT while in Birmingham. The prologue returns to the day she was shot and explains more about what happened before and during that moment. It also ends with, "Who is Malala? I am Malala, and this is my story." Both books are broken down into 5 parts. 3 of the 5 parts have the same or similar titles. They both include an epilogue where both end with the line, "I am Malala, my world has changed, but I have not." The books also include pictures, a glossary, and a timeline of events in Pakistan and Swat. Again, a lot of the same information and content is shared between the two, but with the adult version, the readers sometimes get more information, more pictures, etc. So as Michael mentioned, the tone of the books is similar, and I think that can be seen in the way the 2 books are broken down. I'll leave you with a question to think about. The Young Reader's edition is named "I Am Malala, How One Girl Stood Up for Education and Changed the World." And the adult version is named "I Am Malala, the Girl Who Stood Up for Education and Was Shot by the Taliban." Based off these 2 subtitles, which one do you think more represents Malala and why?
I hope you all enjoyed listening to our presentation. I am going to insert a compilation of all of the questions that we asked throughout the video here. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.